Perfect, sorry.
Welcome to the PhD defense by Anna Pagani. My name is Dr. Sylvia Hostetler. I am replacing Professor Claudia Binder, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight due to sick leave. So it is my great pleasure to lead this ceremony. So welcome everybody in the room and those on Zoom. Those who are not aware of how PhDs are structured at EPFL, just a few words that it's based on 4 years of research. It is defended with a jury a month before the public defense, which we have now this evening, 10th of February. So let me say a few words about Anna before then handing her the floor. Anna is an architect. She graduated cum laude in Architecture, Construction, City at Polytechnique di Torino in 2015. In parallel, she joined a program called Alta Scuola Politecnica for Innovation and Technology Talents, for which she obtained a double master degree with the Politecnico di Milano. Anna won several scholarships, which allowed her to study in different places around the world, including Barcelona, Lausanne, and Beijing. After working as an architect in Shanghai, she joined the HERUS lab in December 2017. During her PhD, she engaged in research, teaching, and communication of her findings to a wider audience of practitioners and citizens. When she was not in the office, she practiced ballet and contemporary dance, sang in a choir, practiced yoga, played the piano, hiked as many mountains as she could find, and attempted to limit her environmental footprint. A few words to the private defense. So that took place on the 1st of December 2021. The members of the jury included Professor Roderick Lawrence, who is honorary professor at the Université de Genève, Professor Michael Davis from UCL London, Dr. Luca Pattaroni, who is a senior scientist at EPFL, Professor Claudia Binder, and Professor Paula Vigano, who was president of the defense. Obviously, it was an excellent PhD. It was nominated for the EDAR doctoral program thesis distinction. And congratulations to that. So now we will give the floor to Anna, who will tell us a little bit more of what she spent the last 4 years with, and her talk will last about 45 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you all for being here. Each one of you might perceive this room in a different way. Maybe it's that big window, or maybe the wooden floor, or maybe that painting over there. Is it sustainable? I don't know. Do you care if it's sustainable? Maybe. Housing accounts for more than a fourth of total energy consumption in Switzerland, and it's the second top contributor to the total carbon footprint of the country. So we should care. But what if a sustainable dwelling is not what I want? What if it's too expensive? If it's too far from my children's school? Or too small for me? Housing research in the Swiss context has increasingly been focusing on strategies to reduce energy consumption and CO2 emissions. However, findings reveal that the mismatch between the dwellings supplied and our residential preferences can have and have had detrimental consequences on their implementation. A well-known example is urban sprawl, where the attractiveness of urban areas for small households with higher purchasing powers has reduced availability of housing in the centers, pushing families to the suburbs, increasing commuting, CO2 emissions, and therefore affecting the health and well-being of humans and of the planet. The rising number of small households is of primary concern in Switzerland. Single-person households comprise more than a third of all Swiss households. Other forms of shared accommodation could be provided to tackle inefficient use of space, but these solutions might be insufficient if they fail to meet residents' needs. It emerges that a sustainable residential sector must be understood as one that meets the needs of its present and future inhabitants while reducing its footprint on the environment. But depicting residential preferences might be a daunting task, especially in the Swiss housing market, where housing costs affect about a fourth of the population in meeting its basic needs, where vacancy rate is extremely low, where the share of tenants is the highest among all OECD countries. Depending on opportunities and constraints, tenants' desire can deviate from what is available and finally selected. So when looking at this complexity, it becomes clear that urban sprawl, housing space consumptions are symptoms of the lack of knowledge of the interdependencies between preferences and dwellings. And this relationship is made explicit in a process called residential mobility, where tenants and households decide first to move and then engage in the search for a new dwelling. And that is why the goal of this thesis was to clarify what determines residential mobility and the interrelations between these determinants, because this was key to illuminate the effect of measures aimed at reducing the footprint of housing while meeting the needs of its households. You may think that's impossible. There are so many reasons why I would decide to move somewhere or to choose a new dwelling, and that in fact is the challenge. However, I had help. I used system science. A systems perspective helped me understand residential mobility as a system of interconnected elements. And this perspective was key to explore, dig into, and disentangle the complexity of the interrelations between households and dwellings. And just like any other system, our homes have a function. What can this function be, how it can manifest itself, and how it can help us go towards sustainability, that was the subject of my thesis, towards sustainability through housing functions, a systems perspective for the study of Swiss tenants' residential mobility. Let me now guide you through the work that has been done so far by other architects, scholars, and systems thinkers, and how the lacunae in their work have offered me a base to explore, dig into, and disentangle the complex relations between residents' preferences and dwellings. I like this quote from Giancarlo De Carlo, who used to say that if we turn to an architectural magazine, we encounter the presentation of a series of buildings which have been photographed and published without people. In fact, it's been more than 60 years since architects, urban planners, and scholars had advocated for the need to take into account the culture and values of residents in housing design. But this is not an easy task, and despite several attempts, the solutions proposed at the time are still far from being implemented at a large scale today, with the exception of few experiments from housing cooperative, for instance, Mehrals Wohnen in Switzerland. To go beyond these experiments, the management of the Swiss housing stock would benefit from tools that would allow housing stakeholders to explore what-if scenarios. What if I was providing only small dwellings? Would residents be happy, and would I achieve my goal of reducing the housing's footprint? Simulation models already exist to evaluate climate-related strategies in the Swiss context, but none of them take into account the preferences of households. And that is why a first gap is that we need context-specific tools for the provision of sustainable housing. But in order to provide these tools, we first need to understand what residential preferences are and what residential mobility is. Residential mobility has been studied by several disciplines: geographer, sociologists, economists, and they express themselves so differently that it seems as if they're speaking different languages. However, agreement has been found around the notion of housing choice, which conceptualizes the residential mobility process as composed of different steps. So first, the household is pushed to move by certain triggers, like leaving the parental home or a rental contract expiration, and then it engages in the search for a new dwelling due to certain pull factors, like the luminosity, the size of the house, or its location. Difficulties in understanding housing choice is predominantly due to the fact that housing is a composite good. So it's made of very different features that can, for instance, lead to both satisfaction or dissatisfaction. This housing size could be perfect for me and not perfect at all for you. They can be updated after a trigger in very different ways. So for instance, after a divorce, certain characteristics that I desire for a dwelling might greatly change. But also what I state as my preference might greatly differ from what I choose in the end, where I move to in the end, due to certain opportunities and constraints in the housing market. So this complexity would greatly benefit from the application of a systems perspective, because it would allow us to transcend disciplinary silos and achieve a holistic knowledge of the interaction between all these different components, and especially to identify potential overarching concept organizing these different housing features. But in order to do that, we first need to understand what system science is and how to apply it to housing. Failure in tackling complex issues is due to our difficulty in understanding and conceptualizing systems. System science is a way to look at all parts of the world beyond the boundaries of any particular science. Central to system science is the notion of holism, because according to holism, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So housing is more than 4 walls and a roof. And system science allows us to the identification of urban principles that are helpful to build representations and tackle complex challenges. Systems are not new to architecture and urban studies. Some of you might have heard of the name of Christopher Alexander or Amos Rapoport, but these were pioneers running counter to established design approaches. And that's why a systems perspective is still far from breaking into the housing realm today. So there is a need for a formal application of the language of system science to housing. But what does a formal application exactly mean? Well, according to Donella Meadows, a system is made of elements, interrelations, behavior, and a function. Let's imagine a football team. It is made of different elements, who are the player. They have interrelations, which are the rules of the game. They have a behavior. They're going to run behind the ball, and they're going to score. And the function of the system is to win. But let's imagine now that the function of the system goes from winning to losing. So we're going to have very bad players, or elements are going to change. The rules of the game are going to change, and the behavior, well, probably they're just going to slowly walk across the field. So the function is the predominant determinant of the way in which a system behaves. And the study of the housing system should start from identifying what the housing function is. This gap is the root of the problem, the foundation that once laid allowed for the construction of each building's floor of this doctoral thesis. So we have seen that we need tools for the provision of sustainable housing. And in order to provide them, we need first to reconceptualize residential mobility with a systems perspective. And to do so, we need to apply the language of system science to housing. And therefore, this thesis aimed to, first of all, provide a framework that allows to identify all these different elements of the housing system, to use this knowledge to reconceptualize residential mobility with new lenses, and in particular apply it to 2 case studies of sustainability, important for housing sustainability. First of all, preferences and choice for housing size, in order to provide housing that reduces size and meets households' preferences. And secondly, to investigate the effects of COVID-19 on residential preferences and understand how to provide residential environments accommodating change and maintaining well-being. Lastly, we wanted to use this knowledge to provide an empirical and context-specific agent-based model, and in particular to use the model to simulate and compare the effects of measures aimed at reducing housing footprint while taking into account residents' needs. Conceptualizing housing as a system, investigating its interrelationships, and simulating residential mobility all contributed via different manuscripts to the overall goal of this thesis. And they were addressed to a very different audience, hopefully bridging the gap between practice and science. Let me now guide you through how this research was designed in order to achieve these goals. First of all, this project is not a standalone. It's part of a larger project called Shrinking Housing's Environmental Footprint, financed by the Swiss National Science Foundation and the National Research Program 73, NRP. The focus of the project was on multi-family rental housing in Switzerland, and it was taking into account 3 dimensions of housing sustainability. The social dimension, so tenants' preferences in the laboratory HERUS, the economic dimension, so owner's management of the building stock in the laboratory LEUR, and lastly, the environmental dimension, so the building stock environmental footprint modeling of the laboratory ESD. The project aimed to develop 3 models that could be integrated in a larger agent-based model, and therefore achieve a holistic understanding of the housing system. The advantage of this project lied in its transdisciplinary component. This means that people outside of academia were involved in the knowledge production, and in particular, 3 collaboration partners, Swiss Mobiliar, who owns dwellings across Switzerland, and 2 housing cooperatives, SCHL in Lausanne and ABZ in Zurich. And then we also had implementation partners, such as the Federal Housing Office and the networks WBG Schweiz and NBS and PUSH. What they did is that they contributed to checking the model against reality and to the future dissemination of its results. To coordinate such an ambitious project, methods had to be carefully designed, and I adopted what is called the mixed method strategy of inquiry. Simply put, it means that I was gathering qualitative and quantitative data sequentially. So I started with a desk research on the housing system. This allowed me to identify the different elements of the housing system and especially its functions. I explored the applicability of this framework to the study of residential mobility in 2 group discussions with tenants in Lausanne and in Zurich, which allowed me to formulate some first hypotheses of how the process of residential mobility could benefit from this new notion. And I formulated that in a multi-step model of tenants' residential mobility. So what happens in every step of my decision to move and where to move? I quantified this model using a survey of tenants. And in particular, I used this model then to explore these 2 case studies that are crucial for housing sustainability. So to identify obstacles and opportunities for reducing housing size. And then using another survey data set, taking advantage of this first wave of COVID-19 and the special conditions in which we found ourselves, to identify recommendations for promoting housing health. This knowledge was lastly used to do agent-based modeling and in particular implement the model called REMOTES, Residential Mobility of Tenants in Switzerland. And using REMOTES, we simulated the effectiveness and effects of recommendations and measures elaborated in the previous step. Let me now guide you through the key findings from conceptualizing housing as a system, investigating its interrelationships, and simulating residential mobility. So we started by using the vocabulary of system science to define what the housing system is. We have seen before the elements, the interrelationships, the behavior, and the function. So let's imagine the housing system as embedded in a larger societal and environmental subsystem, so the culture and the geography, and embedded in that at the micro level, the human and material subsystems. For instance, housing size or other sustainability features. The 2 subsystems interact via the decision, for instance, to move or where to move, or by the way in which residential spaces are used, which depends on the culture and on the geographical location of housing and the materials and technologies available. This structure manifests itself in different ways. And we look more specifically at the housing behavior by looking at the human and material subsystem. So the structure can manifest itself for the human subsystem via residential preferences, and for the material subsystem via dwelling forms. We have seen before that the function determines how the system behaves and the structure that allows the behavior to happen. While meaning has been identified as the most important function of the built environment, several functions can give meaning to a dwelling. So what is housing for? If you think of your house, what is the function of your house? What is housing for? Matteo, what is your housing for?
Sharing.
Sharing?
Yeah, a lot.
Cooking? Elena, what is your housing for?
Sharing is good.
Sharing? Massimo?
Resting.
Resting. Well, let's see if you will find some of these elements. We identified 9 housing functions, such as, for instance, a place for self-representation, where I can express myself, or a status symbol, I really like to invite my friends here, or a shelter, my homely home. And for each of these housing functions, and for different supersystem elements, we have identified how the system behaves, possible behavior of the system. So for instance, for a given culture or geographical location, a shelter can manifest itself via the dream of the homely home, and more specifically, a basic house providing shelter, or a suburban detached house, which is posing so many problems today. A status symbol, depending on the socioeconomic structure and the values of the household, can manifest itself into more desire for comfort and privacy, more facilities indoor, like a gym, a library, and modern forms, styles, and materials. So we can see that the application of the language of system science to housing can be beneficial to identify linkages between the material form and households' preferences, and that these interrelationships are orchestrated by the notion of housing function, which can organize the different housing features as an overarching concept. So we explored this framework in 2 group discussions, and in particular, its applicability to better understand residential mobility. We formulated a multi-step model, and I'm gonna offer you here a simplified version of the findings of the quantification of the multi-step model in the tenant survey. So results of the statistical analysis have showed us that the gap between my current function and my ideal function is a predictor of my level of satisfaction. Again, you might think that's obvious. Like if I desire something and what I have is really different from what I desire, I'm going to be less satisfied. But this was actually very important for us because it helps us understand that the notion of function can be used to understand residential preferences. Then we found that different socio-demographic characteristics are good predictors of my ideal function. So I said before, what I desire as a couple might differ compared to a single tenant or renting from ABZ, CHL, or Mobiliar. The current function of my dwelling influences whether an event is going to trigger my move or not. For instance, if my dwelling is a permanent place, I might be less likely to move for simply a decrease in comfort, but I would rather move for a change in my life or a rental contract expiration. These trigger events can be organized into types: a radical change, a problem to solve, or an opportunity, like I've got accepted in a housing cooperative. And why it is important to classify them as such? Because they help us to understand how the preferences for my new dwelling are going to be updated. In fact, a radical change in my life, like leaving my parents' home or a divorce, we found that it was the strongest trigger to changes in the ideal function for the new dwelling. So this model allows us to see that actually housing function can offer a way to better understand the relationship in the residential mobility process. And as introduced before, we decided to apply this knowledge to understand the choices and preferences of housing size. So in our sample, we found that despite shrinking in size, so for instance, a couple separating or children leaving home, our household were in any ways moving to a larger dwelling. And if we look at the housing size as one of the elements of the material structure influenced by the current function, well, we actually found that tenants were less likely to have reduced housing size if the function privacy or status symbol had gained in importance. But we have also said before that what I choose in the end might differ from what I actually like or wanted due to different opportunities or constraints. So we wanted to ask directly tenants, would you be willing to move if the size of your household was to shrink? And we actually found that only 25% of our tenants will be willing to move in that case. And again, before I have introduced you that the function of my dwelling might influence the likelihood of an event to trigger a move. Remember, a permanent place, I don't really feel like moving. Well, in fact, we found that our tenants were less likely to be willing to move if their dwelling was fulfilling the function of permanence or status symbol. Related to status symbol, we also found that the freedom to choose was hindering the willingness to move to a smaller dwelling. For instance, I can afford my dwelling even if I live in there alone, or there is nobody who is going to check if we are too little tenants in my dwelling. Related to permanence, we found that the cost of moving were playing a big role. So think about if there is no supply of small dwellings around, then I'm going to need to break the ties with my neighbors, and I'm forced to relocate somewhere else. But also the monetary cost of moving, because the dwelling where I spent the last 20 years of my life might cost much less than a new, smaller dwelling. The second application of this model was to look at the effects of COVID-19. Did COVID-19 influence our residential preferences? Well, if it did, then we should see some changes in the ideal housing function. We actually found that for 60% of our sample, at least one function had changed. And in particular, the function self-representation had gained the most in importance during the first wave of COVID-19. And this was especially true for women, highly educated, having given up on cultural activities like going to the movies or to the theater, having felt particular discomfort at home, having taken care of a lot of housework, and do not missing their loved ones, so probably living together with them. On the opposite, a place for production consumption, eating, doing the laundry, sleeping, basic needs had lost the most in importance, but it still remained relevant for a certain subpopulation, in particular men, living alone in temporary housing situations like the hotel or hostels, lacking of free time, and do not missing specifically social interactions. So our empirical analysis allowed us to reconceptualize residential mobility by proposing a multi-step model and overcome the fragmentation of the studies that have been looking at residential mobility so far. Its applications serve to reflect upon measures for housing sustainability because the model was proven useful, first of all, to identify obstacles and opportunities for reducing space consumption. Remember the functions of status symbol, privacy, and permanence, and the monetary and non-monetary cost that must be taken into account when willing to reduce the space consumption. And secondly, and despite the involuntary polarization of profiles, the application of the model allowed us to observe shifts in what are considered basic needs during a pandemic. The multi-step model served as a basis to implement remotes, residential mobility of tenants in Switzerland. It's an agent-based model, meaning that it's a model that simulates the interaction between different agents, that in this case are the households and their dwellings. And it allows us to investigate the macro level effects of these interactions, meaning 1,000 simultaneous moves. So remotes introduces 4 classes of multidimensional agents. So we have tenants characterized by a certain salary or a certain age that are part of a household, which is characterized by a certain level of satisfaction and a type. The type evolves over the passage of time, and it's a determinant to identify the desired functions. In fact, we have seen before that the socio-demographic were a predictor of my ideal housing function. The household lives in a dwelling contained in a building. The dwelling is characterized by a certain number of rooms, by a certain size, and again, by a certain set of functions. These functions are extrapolated based on the characteristics of the dwelling and of its neighborhood and the closeness to certain places of interest. And the matching between the function of the dwelling and the desired function of the agent generates satisfaction. Also, the dwellings and buildings evolve over time. They can be demolished, rebuilt, renovated, etc. So a simplified version of how the model works. At T0, the model is populated with dwelling and households. And the distribution of their attributes is based on the survey data set, on official statistics, or when needed, based on assumptions. Progress in the family, work, or other careers of the household can generate a trigger for which the household is updated as a mover and engages in the search for a new dwelling. The household is going to filter the dwelling it sees based on certain conditions, as if you were searching on the internet. So one of these is affordability, another are occupancy rules. The occupancy rules regulate how many members of a household can occupy a certain amount of rooms in a dwelling. And it's more strictly regulated for housing cooperatives and more loosely for the private asset manager. So the household is going to rank the dwellings depending on the satisfaction that they generate, and it's going to move in the first one on the list. But if it doesn't find a free dwelling for a certain amount of time steps, it's going to out-migrate from the model, searching outside of the sample of ABZ, SHL, and Mobiliar. The model went through calibration, verification, and validation. This is an example of verification, which consisted in running the model over 30 years and check the plausibility of what was happening. So for instance, the change in type after a certain trigger, such as a separation, or the move after a change in job location, which updates the desired function, and of course the postcode. So we used this model to run several experiments. And in particular, I'm going to show you an example of, since we have been discussing about this case study, floor area per capita, and in particular, which measures are the most successful to reduce it. So we have discussed before that a major obstacle to downsizing is the difficulty of finding suitable dwellings to relocate to, and the non-monetary cost associated to that. So in Switzerland, dwellings are predominantly 3 and 4 rooms apartment. So we wanted to provide a diversified offer of housing sizes by increasing the standard deviation of housing size in the model. And we found we obtained a reduction of approximately 3 square meters per tenant. Secondly, our empirical findings had revealed us before that there is a certain preference for large housing and a reluctance to relocate when, for instance, the children leave home. So what we wanted to do is to try to prevent the underoccupancy of shrinking households by applying more strictly occupancy rules. And so in the model, we have increased the probability of the household to relocate after the children leave home, and we find a reduction of approximately 2 square meters per tenant. Lastly, I have introduced at the beginning of this presentation how the increasing number of small households is of primary concern in Switzerland. So we wanted to prevent the formation of one-person household by making it easier for them to find groups to join and form a flat share. So we have increased the compatible difference in age for which they could form groups via multi-generational housing, which has by far the strongest effect. We're talking about more than 4 square meters per tenant. But we also wanted to give them the possibility to search for more dwellings. And this was not bringing about any reduction, which probably shows a certain competition in the housing market. So the model integrates real-world preferences and needs of households of our partners as École, Mobiliar, and ABZ, and on this basis, it allows for a holistic understanding of their interaction with dwellings. The model, however, does not give us answers to truth. It's a tool for reflection. So it helps us understand the limitations of the provision of sustainable housing and how to overcome them. So let me now guide you from the analysis of these results to their synthesis. And let me start by saying that this thesis made 2 overarching contributions. So I started this presentation by arguing that researchers have approached the study of residents' needs in such a fragmented way that we're creating more complexity rather than helping housing owners navigating it. This thesis articulates existing knowledge in a new semantic field that is orchestrated by this notion of housing function. This notion is a synthetic notion, integrative, holistic, and inclusive. More simply, it accounts for the system as a whole and integrates the relative value that different households attached to housing, and it allows us to conduct analysis at the higher systems level, identifying relations between the different determinants of the relocation process that so far were poorly understood. We consider the primary function of housing as being meaning, and the way in which meaning manifests itself strongly depends on contextual conditions. Therefore, although this thesis argued in favor of using a universal framework to study housing, this framework should be used for context-specific design and research. Digital tools played a pivotal role in the application of such knowledge beyond the boundaries of academia. In fact, it helped building bridges between theory and the policy and practice arena by providing an agent-based model that supports a sustainable design and management of the housing stock, but also building bridges between different epistemological stances, putting together the more positivist dimension of simulation models with the processes and motivations of all the different actors that play a role in the housing system. And lastly, bridges between different actors, their divergent perspective, visions, and goals. And in fact, we used the agent-based model during the Forum Mobiliar Thun, together with architects, engineers, policymakers, housing owners, and scientists, and used this model as a platform for systemic co-inquiry, meaning that we could co-construct and explore the effects of possible strategies to reduce housing's environmental footprint while accounting for different stakeholders' priorities and needs. The combination of methods used in this thesis offered the opportunity to overcome the limitation of each of these methods sequentially. However, some overarching limitations remain. First of all, the application of systems notion to the housing context, and in particular to Swiss tenants' residential mobility, required making assumptions on this condition, which resulted in models that are like any other construct. And second of all, the focus of households' preferences and their interaction with the housing form might have sidelined research on the effects of, for instance, the Swiss political system. So the choice of system boundaries is also, of course, a limitation. Lastly, another point, generalizability and context specificity. Because the sample of tenants that we investigated is very specific, and we overlooked critical housing situations such as racial discrimination in housing, or homelessness, or even homeownership itself. And lastly, what constitutes a good transdisciplinary process is a source of debate. However, we believe that more could have been achieved if all the housing stakeholders, including tenants, had been involved in the research process in a way that goes beyond participation. But this would require redefining the role and responsibilities of the non-academic actors involved in the project. And to conclude, let me spend a few words in showing you how this research can help other researchers, practitioners, and teaching to move towards sustainability. So the thesis opened the door to several pathways of future research, and I'm happy to show you one of these. To increase knowledge on the manifestation of the different 9 housing functions in material forms, future research should focus on collecting possible material behaviors for each of the different 9 housing functions. This is housing as a shelter, how it manifests itself depending on the geography or on the subpopulation of tenants. Well, this would remain to be investigated. And conversely, to look at a certain specific system behavior and which functions are fulfilled by this one. Is this place a place for production consumption, a private place, or a place for self-representation? This would help practitioners and designers to provide housing that is compatible with households' needs and preferences. However, I believe that there is no need to wait for future research to take action, and that is why I want to outline 3 important points for housing practitioners. First of all, move away from the problem-solving approach, because measures designed to reduce the footprint of housing, but lacking an understanding of how to make them thrive, can lead to unintended consequences detrimental for housing sustainability. Of course, we need to reduce housing size, and of course, occupancy rules are key to do so. But what if there are not enough small dwellings? What if we risk to break the ties of the people who live in these buildings? Secondly, I invite practitioners to consider the contribution of residents for the success of sustainable housing and co-design together with them new ways in which the housing function can manifest itself. What is a small, sustainable status symbol? Third, start now, because the climate we experience in the future depends on our decisions now. Doing so, however, requires a profound change in the mindset of actors operating in the residential sector, and a powerful channel of communication to enable this transition is education. So I did my doctoral thesis in the doctoral program of architecture, and I would like to outline 3 recommendations for current and future professionals in the field. First of all, teaching needs to be transdisciplinary because architecture is itself transdisciplinary. An example is the ENAC week at EPFL, where architects, together with civil engineers and environmental engineers, work together to tackle real-world challenges in a way that requires the contribution of more than one discipline. However, in order to do that, they need shared vocabulary and tools. And that's why system science must permeate teaching to train future practitioners to manage complexity, and especially deliver designs that are able to account for the complexity of the reality in which they're embedded and are thus inherently sustainable. In fact, we need to teach students that architecture cannot be separated from sustainability, nor can privilege the environmental or economic aspect to the social cultural one. The need arises to give a new identity, perhaps, to the architect as a professional at the service of the common good, making available to people her understanding of the built environment system and her ability to create spaces that can accommodate its complexity. And this need was exhibited at the Biennale of Architecture of this year, where architects were asked to answer the question, how will we live together? A big responsibility for the practitioners of tomorrow. So, who knows what these tribes mean? Well, these are they show long-term temperature trends from 1850 to 2020. So I can hope that by embracing systems complexity rather than urging for its simplification, researchers, practitioners, and students will find new pathways to manage the inertia and long-term impact of the built environment and flip these warming stripes towards sustainability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this lively, insightful, and very well-designed presentation. We now come to the part where you can ask questions, also those at home. We will take questions either through Zoom or from the audience. Who would like to start? Okay, so I will start. I will use my moderation privileges. It's one of the questions I really like to ask each PhD student. That's, what was the biggest challenge doing your research?
That's an excellent question, because there were several, because since we were integrating these different methods, each had a challenge. I think that one challenge was sometimes showing the relevance, especially at the beginning, to our participants of what we were doing, because we couldn't see the final result in each step. But I really felt strongly the need to give back. So especially, for instance, during the group discussion with tenants, we were at the very, very beginning, so they could not necessarily imagine how this knowledge would have been used afterwards. And so somehow trying to give back while you're taking, let's say, knowledge from them, this was for sure a challenge. And I would reflect on potentially new ways to approach this in the future.
Okay. We have one question. Okay. Philippe, floor is yours.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, great talk, Anna. Thank you very much. My question is the following. I noted that when you asked the audience about the function they attached to their dwelling, it was hard for them to answer, and I understand that. But if you had asked them what qualities that dwelling has or what defaults it has, maybe in comparison to other existing or idealized dwellings, it's much easier to answer. I think that's something we observe, we know every day. And therefore I ask myself, is your concept of functions, is that very different from just attaching more or less importance to different qualities of the dwellings? Is that the same idea?
Well, thank you very much, Philippe, for this question. Actually, it is true that by asking directly what are the important qualities of your dwelling, it would be much easier for the audience to reply, because also this notion of function is not something that we're used even to think about. What is the meaning of my dwelling? It's something that is not even in our head when we choose a certain housing. So yes, actually, when we did the simulations with the agent-based model, we looked at how the distribution of housing features for certain dwelling functions. And when we looked at the results of the model, we could see that the notion of housing function was taking into account the different values that tenants were assigning to certain features. So it could be that for a certain, it is true, let's say, that there are that households give different weights to different features. However, one advantage of using the notion of housing function is that it could be that a shelter for a different tenant or a different type of household can encompass the prioritization of different features. So, of course, so this basically means that a shelter for someone in the audience now might mean prioritizing certain features which are not the same from another person in the audience. So it allows us, let's say, to look at this concept from a higher hierarchical level. But future research should definitely investigate more this material behavior to look at whether there are patterns in which a shelter manifests itself and whether certain features are consistently prioritized compared to others for certain housing functions. So it should definitely be the next step of research to look into this.
Your necklace is rubbing against your mic.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to read the question?
No, he just has his hand raised.
Okay. Well, he has the floor. He wants to unmute
You can
himself.
unmute yourself if you have a question. Yeah. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, you said at a certain moment that in a way your approaches could help the teaching, but can you make an example on how your tools and approaches could help our School of Architecture to innovate and to make some continuity in our teaching? So these tools could help in improving the teaching. Can you just elaborate a bit more and make an example on what, in case you were responsible for teaching, what you could introduce?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, actually. Well, the advantage of the language of system science, as said before, is that it can be applied to very different fields and different disciplines. So it is a language that both architects, engineers, and any other discipline actually could learn in order to collaborate. And its greatest advantage is that it allows us to take into account all the different elements of the system that we're looking at. And I could experience how it could contribute to training, let's say, the students of tomorrow, not the practitioners of tomorrow, during 2 courses. So one is the Sustainability Assessment of Urban Systems course that we teach here at EPFL, where we introduce the notions of system science in order to better frame the problem and the sustainability issues of cities that students are looking at. And in particular, we're teaching them to develop causal loop diagram. This is a tool that I have not introduced right now, but that allows to look at the interrelationships between different variables, the causal relationship between variables, and identify leverage points where to act. And secondly, the Master of Advanced Studies on Urban and Territorial Design. We had a course dedicated to systems thinking, and we could see how students, let's say, were really receptive. So they were really interested. They were really driven by learning this language because it helped them also in their project and in better understanding all this large amount of variables that we need to deal with in architectural project, that go from the environmental dimension, the economic one, the social cultural one, and all these different factors that need to be condensed in the design of the dwelling. But system science has a large amount of, let's say, tools. It is not only a perspective to look at the world, as said, beyond the boundaries of disciplines, but also have a very large amount of tools. As mentioned before, the causal loop diagrams, the agent-based model. So depending on what I would teach, let's say, I would, of course, obtain, let's say, different results and teach students to tackle the problem in different ways. But for sure, a big advantage is that it helps students to manage complexity and to take into account very, very different, the interaction between very different factors. And yes, and I think that this thesis has shown just a small amount of the big potential that there is to push this further. And also to mention, I was extremely surprised, positively surprised, by seeing how architects in the Master of Advanced Studies were, in few lectures, very, very well applying notions of system science to their projects. I see a question from Philippe.
Anna, congratulations with your brilliant presentation, and I'd like to build on the previous questioner's contribution. And I'd like to dig a little bit in your epistemological, let's say, assumptions on which your systems approach is based, because when I look at the system science field, I see almost a kind of an epistemological rift between 2 main schools. There's a hard system school, which is kind of an engineering approach, which looks at the outside world, takes a section from that world, and then says, now we're going to build a model that shows the interdependencies between these different subsystems and so on. And when we understand that better, we can intervene in order to optimize its performance. And then you have the soft systems approach, which is very different because it says, we see confusion outside in the world there. And what we're going to do is we're going to build models, but the models are not a kind of a representation of the complexity out there, but merely an aid or an help to support the learning process in dealing with that complexity. And so I wonder where you position yourself with respect to these 2 schools, because I seem to pick up in your narrative, I seem to pick up elements from both.
Exactly, yes. Thank you, Philippe, for this fantastic question. I think that it reveals a bit my pathway as researcher, because I started with the first approach, because I started my PhD in an environmental engineering school. And by applying system science in a way in which I was learning in the environment around me. And then I developed a completely different view while doing research, realizing that there were multiple realities, that the models were not answers to giving us answers to truth, that they were simply a support for reflection. So it's excellent that you could see these two words because they are in fact there. So I started with one approach, and that's where you see the framework that I developed, etc. But then there has been an evolution towards the other one, and that's also what a PhD shows, our evolution, let's say. So I evolved towards the one of recognizing it's a very complex reality, and we can just provide tools that help us navigate this or reflect upon this, but they will not mirror the truth.
That in itself is a wonderful reflection of a learning trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
congrats
very
again.
much. Thank you, Philippe.
I think we have one more question. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anna, for your fantastic presentation. And I think I have a question which is coming from the hard world and working a lot with existing buildings and knowing that this is limiting the environmental impact, and also working with new buildings. And then my question to you is whether your proposition and the choices that you want to allow and that you want to steer for people to move to places and to or make choices, whether that has an impact, whether we can achieve a better environmental performance with the existing buildings, or that all the desires in the modeling results into a huge demand for new, in your case, tiny houses or smaller footprints in meter squares. So how does it influence the demand on the quality and the size of the building stock?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, thank you very much, Gil. One point is that we have found that there was a mismatch between the demand and the supply, meaning that we have in existing buildings, we have households that are under-occupying flats that could be occupied by larger households. And this is, for instance, the example that I have introduced at the beginning with smaller, more affluent households living in larger dwellings in the centers, for which, according to this study of Patrick Rera, we actually, he was explaining that since they are, the population in cities is showing to be decreasing, because we have smaller households occupying the centers and pushing the families to the suburbs. So already a first way in order to understand whether we need new build or we can reuse the existing stock and that will be sufficient would be to have a proper match between the size of the households and the size of the dwellings. So this would mean to apply occupancy rules, that basically in housing cooperative this is done, where the size of the household must match the size of the dwelling. And once we have this match that works, then let's say we could also reflect upon, let's say, do we need actually, what are the demographic trends? Do we need more smaller dwellings? Well, I can also answer by saying that there is a trend towards smaller households. Smaller households in Switzerland, as shown at the beginning, represents 1/3 of all households, and they're increasing. So we need more dwellings for small households. So there is a need also for somehow new build or perhaps a renovation that fragments, let's say, reshapes apartments into smaller apartments. But at the same time, we need to incentivize households in living in multi-generational housing, because the problem is not solved by producing more smaller dwellings, because it means more appliances used by only one household. So it still has quite an important environmental footprint. So we would need to make individuals share spaces, so incentivize multi-generational housing. And for this, for sure, we would need a little bit to rethink our dwellings in a way that they can provide privacy of different households sharing the same dwelling and sharing facilities. So there will be potentially a way to rethink about the current housing stock before thinking about building more small dwellings for small households that could actually be detrimental instead for. And this is exactly where a system science perspective helps us, not this problem-solving approach. I have more small households, I'm going to build more small dwellings, but actually think, okay, I have more small households. Are there other ways where I can intervene in this system?
Okay, do we have a
I
question
think you-
in the let's take one from the audience. Sasha, please.
Yes, first of all, Anna, thank you very much. I'm very impressed. This is wonderful work.
Thank you.
I have a question on sufficiency. So sufficiency in housing tells us that we need somewhere between 10, 15 to perhaps up to 20 square meters per person.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have much more.
Yeah.
So your model, of course, as you just explained to us, cannot give us the answer.
Yeah.
But can it hint how we should think of reducing this not by 3 square meters or 2 square meters or
But
4
much
square
more.
meters, but by a factor of 3? Do you have some hint how to do that?
I'm going to repeat your question for the people online. So the question was regarding sufficiency. So in order to achieve, sufficiency, we will need to reduce much more than just 3 or 4 square meters. So reach potentially 20 square meters per tenant. So actually in the simulations that I run, they were first explorations. So and in these first explorations, I'm going to show you actually something that could potentially reply to answer your question. Voila, I'm going to show that. So, in this first exploration, we have seen, as mentioned before, that shared living would be very important to reduce the number of one-person household, that we would need to apply these occupancy rules, as said before, and especially reshaping the preferences for large dwellings, while but then that pose a problem because they increase the cost of downsizing and reduce the applicability of occupancy rules. So we will need to supply and provide an adequate supply of small housing and incentivize facilitation to smaller dwellings. And lastly, provide this type of new design that reshapes preferences for large dwelling and increases a culture of sharing. What my model did, it's tested each of these measures separately without combining them. Potentially by combining them, we could look at what are the effects and perhaps see that there is a much greater decrease in square meters per tenant. So I simulated individually what it means to provide an adequate supply of housing, what it means doing multi-generational housing, but the next step will be to look at combinations of these and hopefully see whether it helps us reaching sufficiency. Yeah, exactly. He said that it could be non-linear and very effective, just to repeat.
Okay, I think there was a question online. Is that right? They lowered their hand. Is there a question in the audience here? Yes, Matteo.
Yeah, perhaps. Thank you.
You don't have to repeat it. So it's related to one of the previous questions about where you identify yourself in the modeling phase. I think it's also related to this gap between the results that we, as a scientist, we produce and how they are interpreted, especially for models that we expect that models will solve the world and the output of a model will be the solution for everything, right? So, and since you also had this, the chance to experience how to communicate and design a model in a collaborative way, at least for what I understood. So what were the challenges in communicating the results of your model? What you did right, what you did wrong? Mm-hmm. What is the misunderstanding of the potential of remote as? And yeah, like, because I feel myself in the same situation, like I'm a modeler, my model generates results, but then of course they are not the truth. And so yeah, like I would like to listen to your experience regarding that.
That's an excellent question. And I will reply by first showing again something. I'm happy it means that. Actually, I just go quickly. Basically, there is a way of modeling that already exists that includes going to the field work and look together at how to model with participants, going to modeling, simulation, and back to field work, so that it's really a way to make really people participate in and appropriate the model and develop trust in its results, because they're going to understand how it works. And this is the companion modeling approach. And like, this is by far probably the best way to approach it. In my case, it didn't work that way. So I built the model based on the results of tenant surveys, etc., but I developed the model. So this is, let's say, the break between the two. And instead, when you really go in an iterative process together with participants, it's different. They understand step by step how it works, they engage with it, they trust it. So, of course, when we then combined our 3 agent-based model in the project Chef all together, and we presented this model during the Mobiliar Forum Thun, there were some reactions of, people expected to depict reality. It was not a perfect model at the time. Also, that's also the point to mention. We still had some problems in the integration phase of the 3 models. But I think that the way in which it should change is really from the whole process itself. And then another question that I raise in my thesis is, to what extent should the model be accessible directly to participants, so that people could really input the data and do the simulation? The way in which remote is right now, it looks like this. So ask a tenant to run this model is not exactly a good point. There could be other types of interfaces that are much more user-friendly, but the question is then raised about misinterpretation of results, because perhaps one could take it as a truth and not as a tool for reflection. So there are all these challenges that you mentioned, and the best way probably to overcome them would be to integrate participants across the whole research process. This would be my answer right now, and that's one of the answers that I give in my thesis as a limitation and as a way to move forward. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any question? Yes, there is a raised hand. Please unmute yourself.
Philip?
Yes, it's me. Hello. Thank you, Anna, for the presentation. It is a complex topic. To me, it seems that you're trying to eat an elephant. So, good job. It's really, I have so many questions. I have no idea where to start from, but I will be brief. I underlined the 2. So one is regarding just your data gathering. So you did the analysis of tenants in Lausanne and in Zurich. And as we all know, Switzerland is quite a diverse country, which has different cultural heritage, different mentalities, different cantons, different languages. Everything is quite, it is as ununiform as it can be. So have you tested the results of your models in some other areas aside of these 2 urban centers, which is one, for example, would your conclusions be valid in Canton of Ticino or some other places which are maybe more rural, or the places which are a bit less, which are not university centers, etc. And the second question, which has nothing to do with this, is towards the end of your presentation, you ask quite a good question: is how do we rethink a new status symbol? What is the new status symbol that we would housing, which would represent as a status symbol, which is at the same time which is downside. So have you ever, did you think of that? What is your solution? Because currently, if we are thinking of a housing as a status symbol in Switzerland, it is something which currently very few people can have, and if one would want to purchase a house especially in Zurich or in Lausanne, we would have to think of we are speaking about the prices which are a couple of million Swiss francs, so let's say 3-4 million Swiss francs. So how does someone who has actually this budget and this amount, what kind of prevents this person to actually go and buy a huge villa, which is usually the case?
Yeah. Thank you, Philippe. These are
yeah.
excellent questions, actually. And I'm happy to discuss about also all the other ones that you have afterwards. So regarding the first question, it's a very good point. No, our results are not generalizable. So we looked at three housing owners. So Swiss Mobiliar has dwellings across Switzerland, so not only in Lausanne and Zurich, but it represents a third of our sample, because the other two housing owners were in Lausanne and in Zurich, and there were two housing cooperative. So in the model, we simulate the differences between housing cooperative and the private asset manager. They have different rules in terms of how housing is assigned, the number of rooms per dwelling, per person, etc. So we take into account these differences. But one limitation that is stated indeed in the model is that it doesn't take into account more differences between different cantons that also apply different regulations. So there is much more complexity to look into, and we specifically focused on these three housing owners. And so I wouldn't even tell that this is the case for Zurich, but it's the case for ABZ in Zurich. And it's not the case of Lausanne, but for SHL in Lausanne. So, and it's actually, it can be a weakness not to have generalizability, but it is also a strength because we're really looking at the context-specific situation, and housing cannot be generalized. So we have seen that depending on the supersystem structure, it can manifest itself in very different ways. And regarding the question related to status symbol, well, as I invite practitioners and citizens to reimagine how it could manifest itself, that is the exercise to be done. And in the paper that Claudine Carlen and I and Claudia wrote together on obstacles and opportunities to reduce housing size, we really try to sensitize the fact that media play a big role in that. We would need to convey a new image of what is a sustainable status symbol, what is desirable. This will be, of course, one big challenge. But at the same time, my proposition is to understand this function of status symbol and provide dwellings that still fulfill it, but with different housing forms. And yeah, as said, media would be one way, but there could also be new architectural ways. And here I invite my peers, architects, to rethink about this. And I also include engineers, of course. But I invite my peers, architects and engineers, to rethink about how they manifest themselves. So it will be the next step of this thesis, and something that I think should be very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're coming slowly to the end of this Q&A session, unless there are some extremely burning last questions, either from here or from online. Actually, Anna, I have one last question. Since we have at least 6 PhD students in this room, which would be your most important advice to them for the years to come, based on your experience?
On the years to come. Do very different things. In the sense that they tell us a lot that PhD is about digging into one specific topic and become a very expert of it. But my PhD has been about very different things, and I've learned so much. So it was scary because I was walking on ground that was really not stable and touching disciplines that were not mine and being very worried about experts in that discipline criticizing my work. But it enriched me so much to do very different things, and everything enriched my thesis. Everything, all experiences, taking part in conferences that were not my discipline, doing competitions of my thesis in 180 seconds, doing all what I could, enriched a lot and make this thesis very, very dense and very rich, and also allowed me to talk a lot with people. And another point that I would engage is that when you have results, don't be scared of going and telling the word, because academia has these closed doors and it looks like, what is happening behind these walls? It's very good to talk to people. We learn a lot, and they always ask very pertinent questions. So as soon as you have results, just go out and talk about it.
Thank you, Anna. I think these are some nice words to close this session. So follow your interests and don't take the easy way out, if I summarize what you just said, to make it a really enriching experience, to which I can agree. I did my PhD also at EPFL about 200 years ago, and this is also what I took away from it. So now we come to the very formal part. So it's a few minutes before you are actually becoming a doctor at EPFL, so I need my glasses because I'm also 200 years old. Okay, there we go. L'École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, sur proposition de la Faculté de l'Environnement naturel, architectural et construit, décerne à Madame Anna Pagani, née le 28 avril 1992, le grade de docteur ès sciences. La candidate a prouvé son aptitude à la recherche scientifique en présentant la thèse intitulée Towards Sustainability Through Housing Functions, a Systems Perspective for the Study of Swiss Tenants' Residential Mobility, et a réussi l'examen oral exigé par l'ordonnance sur le doctorat dans le cadre du programme doctoral Architecture et sciences de la ville, dont elle a suivi les cours avec succès. Délivré à Lausanne le 10 février 2022. Félicitations.
Merci. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and on behalf of Claudia, she sent me a few words that I would like to read on her behalf now. It's on my phone, so let's see. Dear Anna, I am very sorry not to be able to be there in person to celebrate your public defense. Therefore, I asked Sylvia to read a few words to you. Let's look a little bit to the past. When I met you a few years ago, it was actually virtually, almost anticipating the current situation. You applied for the PhD position, and for me, you came across as an extremely motivated, enthusiastic architect who had done so many different things and had been already traveling around the world. The whole team who was involved in interviewing you was taken aback. The questions were, will she be able to concentrate for 4 years on a PhD project, or will she do so many projects around it that she might not be successful? Will she be able to jump from architecture to social psychology and agent-based modeling? To test this, you had to fulfill a task. The response to the task showed that you were able to get into a completely new topic fast and still think it through deeply. Besides that, I loved your dynamism, thus you completely convinced me. So you were hired as a PhD student at the HERUS lab. Today, I must say, it has been a great and enriching time together. You managed to surpass and go beyond the requirements of the PhD while also learning German, keeping contact with our practice partners, and engaging into corona research aside of your PhD. For me, it has been a pleasure and a great opportunity to accompany you in your academic and intellectual growth. I am convinced that with the approach that we, mostly you, developed, you could revolutionize not only how we see residential mobility, but it is very likely that it will lead to the new dynamics in architecture through the connection with system science. As Sylvia already mentioned, it's amazing what you have achieved in terms of uptake and praise and prizes. Nevertheless, let me say that the greatest is that you've always been supportive of others. You always care of others, and you are humble and dedicated to giving your best and more. Thus, let me thank you for the great time that we already had together, and I look very much forward to the coming months we will share. Claudia.
It's beautiful. Thank you.